welcome to Ship, Sea and the Stars from Royal Museums Greenwich. We're here to bring you stories of the sea, space, history and creativity, all with Royal Museums Greenwich curators and external special guests. If there's a question that you'd like to be answered as a follow-up to what we discussed today, or you've got a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to discuss in the future, do please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And you can find us at, if you search for Royal Museums Greenwich on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. Today, we are talking about celebrities, the famous and infamous figures from history, some of whom are now found in the collections at Royal Museums Greenwich. And so we'll be gossiping about naval heroes and notorious pirates and a unique society beauty. Was celebrity in the past different from celebrity today? And what did it take to win the public vote in times gone by? We will be looking into all of that. Sitting on our virtual sofa, we have three fabulous guests. We have Catherine Gazzard, who is an assistant curator at Royal Museums Greenwich. We've got Quentin Colville, who's a senior curator at Royal Museums Greenwich. And we have Rebecca Simon, who is a historian and the author of Why We Love Pirates. So let's hear a little bit from each of you about your connection to this topic. Catherine, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah, so I work with the art team here at the museum, and my particular specialism is portraiture. And that's really where my kind of interest in fame and celebrity comes from, because although portraits are produced for many different reasons, there is a really strong connection between portraiture and celebrity. It's kind of obvious when you think about it, because portraits are all about image. So a portrait creates a particular identity or persona for an individual, and it can therefore shape how that individual is seen by a wider audience. So what interests me, and what hopefully I'm going to talk a bit more about later on, is how portraits can promote the fame of an individual by presenting particular images of them to the world.
Fabulous. Quentin.
Hi there. I'm senior curator for research at the museum, and I was the curator of an exhibition that we had at the museum back in 2016 on the subject of Emma Hamilton. I've just always been intrigued by someone who never really fitted any of the very established categories of fame and celebrity, but was actually incredibly famous nonetheless, and who's well represented in our collections. So that's kind of got what got me thinking about this subject.
Brilliant. And last but not least, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca, and I'm a historian, and my book is called Why We Love Pirates, The Hunt for Captain Kidd and How He Changed Piracy Forever. I did my doctorate on the subject of piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries, looking specifically at public execution of pirates. And I've always been very interested in how images of infamous figures change. How did, for instance, in this case, pirates, how did they go from being seen as criminals into such iconic characters today, such as Jack Sparrow? And also, were they always seen as criminals from their original time period? So I love looking at objects, like taking a look at other types of portraits, wood carvings, songs and poems written about these figures from the time period, because it shows that, you know, even back then, something about piracy was very nuanced.
I love that we've got a subject that's going to take us all the way from the most sophisticated of society, you know, whoever's in fashion, to the grittiest, nastiest lives you can find on the open ocean. Well, we're going to start with an extract from Treasure Island, which was, of course, written by Robin Louis Stevenson in 1883. And it's one of this country's most famous adventure books. I read it as a child. And of course, it set the expectations of many generations when it came to what you might find at sea. So here is the extract read by Simon Cain.
His stories are what frightened people worst of all. Dreadful stories they were, about hanging and walking the plank, and storms at sea, and the dry Tortugas. By his own account, he must have lived his life among some of the wickedest men that God ever allowed upon the sea. And the language in which he told these stories shocked our plain country people almost as much as the crimes that he described. My father was always saying that the inn would be ruined, for people would soon cease coming there to be tyrannized over and put down and sent shivering to their beds, but I really believe his presence did us good. People were frightened at the time, but on looking back, they rather liked it. It was a fine excitement in a quiet country life, and there was even a party of the younger men who pretended to admire him, calling him a true sea dog and a real old salt and such like names, and saying there was the sort of man that made England terrible at sea.
So there we go, a description of this someone who turned up in an inn and told stories. And the thing that I find really interesting about that is that it shows that whatever, like the implication is that whatever people thought of him, they thought something, and it brought them together, telling the stories and having opinions about this guy. What struck all of you? Let's start perhaps with Rebecca, you first, since it's an ocean one.
Sure. I love the book Treasure Island. I've studied it extensively, and I think this clip, though, is absolutely fantastic to really start things off because, it just strikes me right away, just looking at how people are listening to this one person telling these tales, how they're interpreting it, and showing right then and there that these stories about, these sea dogs, or as we will know, pirates, are both frightening, but also, as he says towards the end, quite exciting as well for people to come in and hear these stories. And of course, this book was written about 150 years after the end of the golden age of piracy, but it really does harken back to pirates of that time period and puts them into this new adventure novel, which is what changed our perceptions of piracy up to this day. And so I just listened to that clip and I just find the significance of it just so great for the topic of celebrity, because this is really showing just how these sea dog characters are going from these kind of unknown, frightening characters, but also into these kind of exciting things. People admit, like, as scary as they could be, they're actually quite exciting to be here. So I love this clip. I love the book. I think that's kind of a perfect way to really kind of showcase the celebrity of the time period.
Awesome. Catherine, how about you?
Yeah, I think what I like about that clip is sort of on one level, it's really about local celebrity. It's Stevenson is imagining the kind of impact that a character like Billy Bones, the kind of the storyteller in that extract, would have had on a small coastal community. And I'm sure this kind of thing really did happen in places like ports, where you had seafarers and travelers from all over the world coming together and swapping stories. They must have been really fertile breeding grounds for reputations and for legends. But at the same time, I think a lot of the things that extract describes also translate to celebrity on a much larger scale. So even when we're talking about national heroes or global stars, we can still think about how different people respond to their stories in different ways, and the role that their stories play in bringing people together and bringing communities together. And those are kind of some of the things that I think make studying celebrity really interesting.
And Quentin, how about you?
I think it kind of brings home the charisma of otherness, the way in which lives that are lived by completely different rules are really fascinating to people. It sort of reminds me of the mythologies around smugglers or around highwaymen, the sense that there are people who break the rules, live a completely different life, and almost because of that are fascinating to the rest of us who feel that we're bound by conventions that clearly these people don't feel apply to them.
I'm sure that's particularly true in lockdown, when all of us have forgotten what any other kind of life would be like. Okay, well, having started with Treasure Island, we have to start with a pirate. So Rebecca, tell us about your first object.
So my first object is a engraving of the pirate Captain Kidd as he is hanging in chains. This was produced after his execution, which was at the end of May 1701. Just to give a little bit of background about who Captain Kidd was, he was a former privateer for the East India Company who was charged to go rob certain ships in the East Indian Ocean, and he unfortunately robbed the wrong one. Whether or not it was intentional is a bit unclear. It's debated. He also did get into a fight with the crewmate and killed him on board. So this is what ultimately made the British go after him as a pirate. Also because he upset the Indian Mughals there, who threatened to cut off trade. So Britain had to make an example of him. They chased him for about 2 years until finally he's captured in 1699, thrown in jail in Boston, shipped back to London for trial in 1701. And they say if you can produce your letter of marque, which is essentially the contract saying you're a privateer, which is someone who robs ships by contract for a government. Think of it like a legally sanctioned pirate for hire. But they weren't able to produce it, unfortunately. So he was executed at Execution Dock in Wapping in East London. And Pirates generally, traditionally, were executed on the banks of the Thames in Wapping to symbolize where they committed their crime on the sea. And they would often get hung up in a gibbet or kind of placed on a pole in the water for until 3 tides would wash over them. Captain Kidd was a special case, however, because they kept him up there as an example anywhere from 3 to up to possibly 20 years. We're not quite sure. Dipped him in tar, so that way, at the end of his tenure being strung up, he would have been nothing but bones and bits of scrap. And this was meant to serve as a warning, one, to other pirates, and also to the people who might consider the life of piracy to be exciting or enticing. This image of him in a gibbet has been used in other sources of popular culture. For instance, in one of the opening scenes of the first Pirates of the Caribbean film, The Curse of the Black Pearl, when Jack Sparrow sails into Port Royal, there's several bodies of long decomposed pirates hung from gibbets with a warning, and he salutes them. And Captain Kidd was seen as quite of a martyr to other pirates. I found newspaper clippings later of pirates in battle saying they refused to go to the way of Kidd, to be strung up at what they called Hope Point, which was their facetious name for execution dock. So Captain Kidd became, he was quite a celebrity at the time. His trial was published verbatim, which sold out within a day, the day after his execution. There's rumors that he may have left buried treasure because he wrote a letter saying he'd hidden treasure to try to get out of his imprisonment. There was nothing found, but people still look for it to this day. And there were loads of stories that were very much based upon him. So this image here, or the image of him strung up in a gibbet, really kind of shows his infamy and also shows just how his image spread to other people. And what I think is interesting to note about it is he looks like a sailor actually wearing quite nice clothes, not like the stereotypical person we see, which shows his ranking. But it also does show very much, just how present they were keeping him in the public's eye by stringing him up for such an amount of time and by creating such a graphic drawing, which circulated around everywhere, which has been reproduced constantly in publications up to today.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the difference is what I can argue about whether it's degree or of kind, but people talk about celebrities being used today, being exploited by others for the purposes that other people have. So let's just go back in Captain Kidd's story a bit. When he was actually at sea before he was caught, was he known then, or was it only when he was captured that his name became more publicly recognized?
What's interesting is he was known for quite a bit beforehand, because about 3 years before Captain Kidd entered the East Indian Ocean in 1698, there was a pirate named Henry Avery who was also going into the East Indian Ocean in 1695. He was a British pirate who ended up robbing loads of Indian Mughal ships, possibly even kidnapping one of their daughters. The British were never able to apprehend him, and the Indian Mughals threatened to cut off all trade if this ever happened again. And then you have 3 years later, Captain Kidd coming in and doing the same thing. Britain could not afford to lose this really lucrative trade. Going into India, they would lose what were considered to be necessities, teas, silks, porcelains, that sort of thing. So they had to really make an example. And at the same time, the printing industry had really come into its own in London and was also flourishing in colonial America as well. And so newspaper reports about him had been circulating very widely for the period of time before he was captured. By the time he was captured in 1699, that was even more dramatic because he was lured to Boston by a friend of his who was governor, Lord Bellamont, governor of both New York and Massachusetts. He didn't want to be associated with a wanted pirate at the time, because Kidd had to be made this example of, but he did not want to be associated with him. So he lures Kidd to Boston, promising shelter, has him thrown in prison. And he's there for 2 years. And in the meantime, lots of stories are published about him. Piracy in particular in North America was a big subject because so many colonial Americans depended on the maritime world for their livelihood. So it was a particular interest to know about a pirate that was captured in Boston, one of the largest ports of the time. And Boston's also where the printing industry is the largest in colonial America as well. So people have access everywhere to the information. So by the time he goes to London and by the time he's put on trial, people know who he is. People crowd into the courtroom. It's quite an event for several days, quite an exciting event. If you read the trial transcript, it really does sound like it comes out of a overdramatic courtroom drama in a sense. And then thousands of people went to his public execution, which was advertised in all the London newspapers. And then when his trial transcript was published, it sold out within hours, and they had to do a second reprinting just the next day, many of which have survived. You can read copies of them in the British Library. So they're still very much available for us.
It's interesting how we have, soap operas were a thing perhaps more in the 80s and 90s than now. This sort of television drama that you can almost watch as real life unfolds in this slightly unrealistic situation. And I guess there is something very compelling about having to wait. It's not just like a story where you can read to the end of the book. Like, there's genuine jeopardy. You don't know what's going to happen next. Are they going to catch him? And it's kind of like watching that in real time. Well, we'll come back to Captain Kidd, but let's move on to someone who had a completely different type of celebrity. And as with many celebrities today, perhaps what she is best known for is not really her major contribution. But as we'll see, the difference between the real person and the public persona can be pretty dramatic. So Quentin, tell us about your first object.
Right, this is a portrait of Emma Hamilton that was painted by one of the most celebrated portrait artists of the age in around 1786, George Romney. But we just need to know a bit more about who this person is. She was christened Amy Lyon, born in 1765 in rural Cheshire. Her father was a blacksmith. She came to London probably at around the age of 12, went into domestic service. But by her late teens, through her partnership, a sort of creative partnership with George Romney, she was a very famous person. It was an extraordinarily creative, painterly relationship. She was introduced to him by her lover, a young aristocrat called Charles Greville. It could have been a sort of a one portrait commission. It could have ended there. But in the end, Romney painted perhaps 60 or 70 portraits of Emma. And what Emma brought to this was a combination of ambition, an extraordinary performative ability, the ability to bring characters and persona into focus for Romney, and to allow him to kind of reach the creative goals that he himself wanted to find. So she wasn't a sort of stuffy traditional sitter who always had one eye on respectability. She was a born performer who was extraordinarily skillful in allowing Romney to realize his own ambitions. And that portrait of her is of her at about the age of 21. It looks rather melancholy. And I think the reason for that is that Emma had at that point left Britain for Naples. And Romney, the artist, was feeling rather forlorn and adrift without the person who had been the kind of the anchor of his creative collaboration for so many years. So it's rather a sad painting.
And how does it, I mean, normally when a painter paints a painting, it's the painter who's the famous one. Either they paint someone who is already famous because they've been paid to, or they're the important person, and their character is just, it could be anybody. What was it about Emma that would switch that around so that she became the dominant, or, the important one in that relationship?
I think that was partly about the trajectory of her life. At the time when he was painting her in the 1780s, she wasn't really known, but her face was known because of the portraits and because of the prints that were made of the portraits. So there was a sense in which her image circulated in British society. People knew that image, but they didn't know the person behind it. So it's only further on in her career that she becomes famous in her own right, and that her own story starts to come to the foreground. And at that point, she becomes a genuine celebrity who, to some extent, rivals the fame of the artist who'd been capturing her image earlier in her life. So there's an interesting kind of, it's not a rivalry because the two of them were very good friends, but there's the sense in which her fame takes over from his and potentially obscures it.
And it's interesting because we think of sort of manufactured celebrity as being a modern thing, that boy bands get created and they're chosen and it just happens to be them. And yet,
yes,
this clearly was possible. Was she unusual in being, you know, sort of manufactured as a celebrity like that at the time, or was that a common thing?
It wasn't common. She certainly wasn't the only person who was doing this. But I think her trajectory is very different because of the combination of aptitude and ambition and intelligence and performative ability that she brought to the role of model, which took her into a completely different category, and was also the springboard for creative achievements later in her life. So I think, you know, she's not without parallel, but there's something very unique about her story, which I think almost also compromises her fame, because she doesn't quite fit into a pigeonhole.
It was, you know, reading about her life before this, it was very striking to me that she, you know, we have this picture of what womanhood was supposed to be at the time. There were all these things you were supposed to do, and these social things. Here was your box, and you fitted into it, and off you went. And she did not fit into boxes, right? She was imaginative and interesting, and like everything she did was just something she wasn't supposed to be doing. Have I got that right?
Absolutely right. I think Emma is someone who crashes through social and cultural boundaries and barriers all the way through her life. She's driven to do it because of performative ability and ambition, but it means that she's often actually a threat to other people and to established social relationships. So the more prominent she becomes, the more she's prone to those sort of whispers and critiques behind her back about her lowly origins, about her accent, her rural accent, about her presumed sexual indiscretions. Those sorts of things become a leitmotif in how she's appreciated. So yeah, no, I agree with you completely. She's someone who breaks an awful lot of rules, and ultimately she can't break all of the rules, and they come back to bite her.
Well, we will come back to that later on, because of course we can't leave these stories halfway through, but we'll come back to that. So you know, this question of suspense in stories is really important, I think. And our next celebrity almost had suspense built into his life, because he genuinely would disappear for months, and no one knew whether he was going to come back or not. So Catherine, tell us about what you've got to show us.
Yeah, so my first object is a portrait of Commander James Clark Ross, who was a naval officer in the first half of the 19th century, and who became famous for his involvement in polar exploration. So this particular portrait was painted by the artist John Robert Wildman in spring 1834, and it celebrated Ross's return the previous autumn from an epic 4-year Arctic voyage, which he had undertaken with his uncle and fellow polar explorer, John Ross. So I'll give you a little bit of background about this particular voyage, because it is an incredible story. So in May 1829, the two Rosses and their crew set off in a steamship called the Victory. And their plan was to chart a particular area of the Canadian Arctic and to return within 15 months. However, they became stuck in the ice for 3 successive winters, and then they had to spend another year trekking across the Arctic on foot before they were eventually rescued by a whaling vessel. And throughout that time, they had no mechanism of contacting home. And so back in Britain, people were sort of left to speculate about what had happened to this missing expedition. And when they suddenly turned up out of the blue in October 1833, it caused a public sensation, and people were really gripped with this story of miraculous survival. And this fitted into a broader public fascination with polar exploration that existed in Britain in the first half of the 19th century. And this kind of craze for all things polar had begun building in 1818, when Britain undertook its first large-scale Arctic voyage. And there were several more expeditions to both the Arctic and a few to the Antarctic over the next few decades. And explorers, when they came back, would present their findings to the public through exhibitions and lectures and lavishly illustrated publications. And so people had access to more information about the polar regions than they'd ever had before. But at the same time, the Arctic and the Antarctic retained this sense of mystery and sort of intrigue, because these voyages would go off and they'd be gone for years at a time with, you know, sort of very little communication with home. And so it created a lot of space for imagination and speculation. So really it's this kind of heady mix of fact and fantasy that feeds into a kind of fascination with the Arctic and also with the explorers who were going to these places. Although I should say it's sort of very much the sort of commanders of the expeditions who get to claim all the accolades. Unfortunately, the ordinary crewmen are not nearly so prominent.
What a surprise. I should say that the UK still has a research ship called the James Clark Ross. I've spent a month at sea on it. And so he's not entirely forgotten in the UK polar community. I mean, the ones that came back tend to be the ones that there's slightly more credit for them in the current scientific cohort, I think. So tell us about the portrait itself, though, because the portrait, I mean, you know, it's one thing to go off and be the subject of, you know, to earn your celebrity, to turn up in this dramatic fashion, all of that kind of stuff. But this portrait here, I mean, this is showing him in a very specific way. It's a very, I mean, I don't pay any attention reading gossip mags, but in the modern era, this is the sort of thing, this is like a cover photo or something, right? This is presenting him in a very specific way. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So I think this portrait is a really good example of the sort of close relationship that exists between portraiture and celebrity. So we know the painting was owned by Ross's father, and presumably for him it did have quite a lot of personal significance. It, you know, allowed him to express his pride in his son's achievements. But at the same time, it's an image that becomes really publicly visible because it's exhibited to the public in London at the Society of British Artists in May 1834, and then it's engraved as a print. So it circulates kind of really widely as a sort of reproduced image. And I think one of the reasons why it proves so popular is because it is a really stunning portrait, and it plays into all the kind of mystique around polar exploration. So Ross is clearly presented as an Arctic explorer because you've got an Arctic landscape in the background. I think a more interesting detail, though, is the scientific instrument that's down in the bottom left-hand corner of the painting. And that's a dip circle, which is an instrument for measuring magnetism. I'm led to believe, not being very up on 19th century physics myself, but this alluded to a particular scientific achievement that Ross was really well known for. So while he'd been stuck in the Arctic between 1829 and 1833, he had led a sled team to investigate the Earth's north magnetic pole. And this was one of the kind of big stories that came out of the expedition. So when they came back in 1833, there was sort of a lot of newspaper stories about how Ross had discovered the Earth's north magnetic pole. That was kind of a bit of a misnomer, because actually the magnetic pole kind of moves around. It's not a fixed point, so it could be kind of rediscovered in a new location several years later. But this was kind of what Ross was known for publicly, and by including that little detail in the portrait, Wildman, the artist, kind of reinforces that aspect of Ross's public reputation, and he reminds viewers of what they might have read about or heard about Ross elsewhere. So it's kind of, the portrait is working in tandem with kind of other sort of media outlets to create Ross's fame. But really, I think the key aspect of that portrait and what gives it so much impact is Ross himself. You know, he's the real focus of the image. He literally sort of fills the canvas, particularly because he's wrapped up in this huge bear skin that he's got slung over one shoulder. And obviously, on one kind of level, that's sort of an allusion to his status as an Arctic explorer. It suggests his need to protect himself against really cold climates. But don't think for a second this is an outfit that he would have actually worn in the Arctic. You know, his sort of actual polar clothing is obviously much more practical and much less decorative. You know, it's really striking here that he's wearing underneath that bearskin his full dress uniform. So that's his most formal naval uniform that's got all this sort of extra gold detailing and these sort of this red decoration at the cuffs and at the collar. And so really this is a kind of theatrical costume that is sort of Arctic inspired, but it's designed to sort of make Ross appear like someone who deserves a place in the sort of upper echelons of fashionable society. And it's sort of making him a really kind of charismatic character. And actually, I did some research around the portrait about who else at the time was being represented wearing fur. And you do find it in portraits associated with travel. So sort of aristocrats in the 18th century, when they went on their grand tour of Europe, they might be painted in a fur traveling cape. So obviously that's a kind of relevant association here. But I also found that you get a lot of sort of popular actresses from this time being depicted with fur accessories and fur cloaks. And while not obviously suggesting that Ross is kind of modelling his image on popular actresses, I think it tells us that fur clothing did have a kind of an association with glamour and luxury. And that's kind of being brought into play in this portrait too, to kind of enhance Ross's kind of public appeal.
Well, anyone who can combine glamour with genuine Arctic exploration is doing well in my book, because it's not glamorous. Been there, done that. They're really not glamorous at all. Very exciting. All the rest of it, glamour not involved. So if you're the audience just joining us, this is Ship, Sea and the Stars, the online webcast from Royal Museums Greenwich. And this week we are talking about fame and infamy. That's why I'm not allowed to. I'm not infamous. Can't even say the word. With Catherine Gazard, Quentin Colville, and Rebecca Simon. And of course, in the modern world and in the past, celebrities were defined by what other people said about them more than what they said themselves normally. So we're going to start the second half with a quote about Emma Hamilton from Goethe after the German poet saw her perform in Naples in 1787.
Sir William Hamilton has had a Greek costume made for her, which becomes her extremely. Dressed in this, she lets down her hair and, with a few shawls, gives so much variety to her poses, gestures, expressions, etc., that the spectator can hardly believe his eyes. He sees what thousands of artists would have liked to express, realized before him in movements and surprising transformations. Standing, kneeling, sitting, reclining, serious, sad, playful, ecstatic, contrite, alluring, threatening, anxious. One pose follows another without a break.
So Quentin, this is linked to your next object. So tell us about that and how it links to the quote.
Sure. Well, this object is one of Emma's attitudes, and they're a complex thing to explain to us now. But they were effectively a sort of flowing series of tableaux vivants, in which Emma conjured up characters from old master paintings, from classical antiquity, in very rapid succession and soundlessly. And this took Europe absolutely by storm. It was an incredibly successful art form. I think behind it lies a very complex story, though. If we go back to Romney's studio in the 1780s, Emma's lover then, Charles Greville, decided that he really wanted a wealthy wife, and having an incredibly glamorous and very famous lover was not helping. So he decided to send Emma to Naples, effectively to become the mistress of his uncle, Sir William Hamilton, who you heard at the start of that quote. Emma had no idea of this intention. She went to Naples expecting her lover to follow her. When she got there, he didn't. She was outraged, wrote back to him saying, "If I was with you, I would murder you and myself both." And then in Naples, she falls on her feet. She learns Italian, she learns French, she soaks in the collections of Sir William Hamilton in his residence, and she produces this art form, which I think that the brilliance of it is that rather than being in the hands of an artist's representation of her, she becomes the artwork, the performer and the artist. And so the attitudes capture also the spirit of the age, the fascination of elite society with classical mythology, with old master paintings. She brings all of this to life in the most transfixing way. And you get the impression that when she was performing the attitudes, she was sort of suspended above all critique, all social criticism just sort of melted away because she was so extraordinarily good at this. It was only when the attitudes stopped and she went back to being Emma that the criticisms began once again. So we shouldn't underestimate the impact of these images in this performance. They went across Europe. You could find her image on coffee cups in Berlin. The Empress of Russia had paintings of Emma. She was enormously famous as a result of this innovation.
So it's a sort of combination thing, that there was a live performance of some sort at a gathering, but then also the images of what she was doing also then went far beyond that.
That's exactly right, and it's because Sir William Hamilton was the British envoy in Naples, so his palace, his residence was where everyone who was everyone ended up for evenings and soirees, and you get the feeling that an evening with less than 50 people in the house was a quiet one for Sir William and Emma. And so all these are people from all over Europe who are coming, and they watch Emma perform. And then also a lot of them are artists, and artists are drawn to this phenomenon. And so her image is accelerated firstly through the performance and secondly through the images. And then, of course, she marries Sir William Hamilton in 1791, and that takes her into a further realm of transformation after that. So she's this chameleonic character who is right at the sort of cusp of European culture, but also, you know, she's from rural Cheshire.
And what's the status of her during this period? Because, you know, she clearly doesn't have an important family history. She doesn't have her own wealth. She's sort of catapulted into these very high-end, you know, society events. How did people respond to her? Were they respectful of her? How, you know, just in the question of her celebrity,
Yes.
Was she an object or was she in control? How did this work?
She was both. I think it's safe to say that she was never completely accepted. I think it's equally safe to say that there was absolutely nothing Emma could do to join the ranks of the British and European beau monde of that period. She wasn't born into it, and that was really the only criterion that mattered to them. So in a way, she's surrounded throughout these years by people who kind of stroll in a leisurely fashion through life, not really having to think about their identities because they're powerful and privileged. And Emma is running to kind of reinvent herself, to transform herself into things that give her a purchase, that allow her to be influential and stop her life being so precarious, because ultimately she doesn't have money. She's dependent upon the sort of patronage of other people. At any moment, her life can fall to pieces.
And how calculated is all of this? Because it's one of those things that sometimes seems to tarnish some modern celebrities. Oh, well, they were trying too hard. You know, they were trying to have this influence. And, you know, this question of whether it's exploitation or whether it's an artist's own, you know, they wanted to do this. Some, you know, agent said, oh, no, you have to do this thing you don't want to. How does that work with her?
I think we can be pretty confident that the attitudes are really flow from her desires, her aspirations, and she's very controlling of them. It's a performance that she repeats hundreds of times, that she perfects over a period of time. But I think one of the things to remember about Emma is that she has an enormous respect for education, for application, for hard work, and what she makes seem so utterly effortless in the attitudes is actually the product of an incredible regime of sort of mastering her movements, her gestures, her expressions, and the way in which she conveys those to an audience and also to an artist. There's an enormous amount of work going on behind the scenes. And I think that's what gives me the sense that to whatever extent she can, she wants to be in control of this. She can never be completely in control of it. And ultimately that control eludes her.
Well, we'll move on again. And now we think of, you know, celebrities are often associated with gossipy magazines, even in these days where the magazines are all online. The gossip hasn't gone away. So, but these gossipy magazines have been around for a while. And Catherine's next object is going to give us a flavour of what they were like in the past. And it's a review of a portrait of James Clark Ross. So here's the reading.
Extract from the Ladies' Magazine, May 1834. This is a spirited, well-painted portrait of a gallant-looking gentleman who has in his gala Arctic dress made himself a very picturesque bundle of fur. Whether it is a likeness, it is beyond our critical acumen to discover, not having seen the original, whom we think rather an injured personage, for he certainly has as great claims to be considered an intrepid polar hero as his far-famed uncle, who certainly takes no pains to sacrifice to the Graces, yet no one seems to care for Commander Ross. To atone for this undeserved public neglect, the brave commander ought to be made a pet lion of by the ladies.
So, Catherine, tell us what this is. I love the idea that they've pointed out that he's not as famous as his uncle.
Yes. Well, yeah, to give you a bit of background about that review, so that's a review of the portrait by John Robert Wildman of James Clark Ross that we saw earlier on. And it's published in the Ladies' Magazine in May 1834 to coincide with the exhibition of the portraits at the Society of British Artists. So it tells us to kind of start off with how that portrait is part of a broader media landscape. You know, it's not just the painting itself that is promoting Ross's fame, but it's also the press coverage around that. And yeah, it tells us that rivalry is a really kind of important aspect of fame in this period, because it's playing Ross off against his uncle by sort of inviting the readers of the Ladies' Magazine to really sort of to make up for the undeserved public neglect of Ross compared to his uncle, and by making him, it uses a rather charming phrase, by making him their pet lion. And so yeah, so it's obviously sort of John Ross and James Ross had travelled together in the Arctic between 1829 and 1833, and they were related. But actually, after they got back, their relationship did kind of become increasingly strained. So James Clark Ross got more kind of official recognition. He was celebrated by the Admiralty and got a new naval commission. He was feted by the scientific establishment as well. He got invited to give papers at the Royal Society. Whereas John Ross didn't get the same kind of official accolades, but he did initially a much better job of kind of courting popular support and was really kind of a popular public figure. But sort of slowly the press kind of turns against him a little bit. It sees him as a bit of a showman, like he's trying a bit too hard. And this review kind of falls in this period where sort of increasingly people are turning to James Clark Ross and saying, well, actually, maybe he's the one we should be celebrating. And it's actually really interesting that they kind of pick up as a sort of important point of, you know, or important point in James Clark Ross's favour is that he is younger and better looking than his uncle. And so I think that's one of the interesting things in that extract we just heard, is that the Ladies' Magazine does celebrate what we might call today James Clark Ross's sex appeal. Obviously, it doesn't use that kind of language. It's kind of language is framed in 19th century kind of ideas of propriety and decorum. But nonetheless, it leaves us with the impression that James Clark Ross is an attractive man. It says he's very gallant looking. And it says in Wildman's portrait, he is a very picturesque bundle of fur. And that accords with what we know about, or what we're kind of told about James Clark Ross from other sources of the time. So Lady Franklin, who knew him really well, she says he's the handsomest man in the Navy. And his good looks were certainly an important factor in ensuring his popularity over his uncle, John Ross, who was sort of 20 years older and perhaps past his peak, we'll say. And actually what the Ladies' Magazine says is that John Ross took no pains to sacrifice to the graces. So basically it's saying he's not very gracious, he's not very elegant. And that was actually pretty kind compared to what some other magazines of the day said about John Ross. Fraser's magazine, which is another publication, said that he looked and moved like a walrus, which is not very flattering at all.
That is definitely
kind of
flattering. Yeah. But it's interesting here, isn't it? Because there's a gendered nature to this celebrity. Mm-hmm. That, you know, normally in that period, women generally did not have very much economic power. They didn't have any political power. You know, they were considered sort of secondary in almost every way, apart from possibly sewing. But when it comes to deciding who a celebrity is, suddenly the women's opinions about, you know, there's something gendered. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, the Ladies' Magazine, as the name suggests, is it's targeted at a kind of female audience. It has a circulation of about 15,000 to 20,000, so it's reaching a really wide audience. And it was quite an influential publication too. So we have letters from Charlotte Bronte where she talks about how she used to read it when she was growing up and how it helped inspire her to become a writer. So it's really kind of important, influential women's publication. It actually claimed to be written by ladies for ladies, although that was a little bit of a misleading claim because the editors of the magazine were men and they employed a mixture of female writers and professional male journalists. And the particular review we just heard is unsigned, so we don't know who the author is. It could have been a female writer. I suspect it's more likely to have been a male journalist. But in any case, it's sort of putting forward a feminine perspective and addressing a female audience. And that tells us that women were a significant part of the audience for polar exploration, which might be a little bit surprising.
That's a sentence that I've never heard uttered.
Well, I guess. Yeah, so the image that's come down to us of 19th century polar exploration is extremely masculine. You know, sort of the polar explorer is often presented as the archetypal manly hero, you know, going to these incredibly hostile environments and confronting nature at its most extreme. But this is a pretty inaccurate portrait in a number of ways. Firstly, because it kind of it represents the Arctic as this really hostile place where only heroes dare to go, which completely ignores the whole communities of people who live there and for whom it's their home. But also it obscures the role that women played in the 19th century in shaping ideas of polar exploration at home. And they did this by being consumers of, patrons of, and even sometimes creators of polar artworks, polar texts, and polar exhibitions. And
well, let's stop there. We're going to move on. There's a whole that opens a whole load of doors there, but we're going to move on to another aspect of celebrity, which we touched on at the start. But of course, celebrity lives are the subject of a lot of attention. But one of the features of celebrity is it does come with this sort of whiff of immortality, because the newspaper articles don't stop when the person stops. So Rebecca's final object opens the door on what happens after someone dies. So Rebecca, tell us what your object is.
So my object is a handwritten copy of the Ballad of Captain Kidd. And this was published very soon by an anonymous author, very soon after Captain Kidd died. And what this does is it kind of tells his story. Now, these ballads were often written about people. There were several about different pirates. And they generally were either meant to be a biography, meant to kind of praise the person, vilify the person, or just simply tell a general story about the person. This one was reproduced as a broadside printed throughout London. Broadsides were large sheets of paper that were sometimes pasted onto buildings that people could pick up and spread around. They would often get either recited or sung in different taverns and public houses. And the ballads were really accessible because people would often put them to a pretty simple tune that anyone could really remember. So this particular one I think is quite special because it has become a very popular sea shanty today. So a lot of people still like to sing it. You can go on YouTube, hear different, sea shanties have become quite popular online recently, like on TikTok and that sort of thing. So it's become a very, so sea shanties are kind of on the up and up again, and it's featured in lots of playlists. So this is something where Captain Kidd's life quite endures. And this one is told from the perspective of Captain Kidd, sort of being kind of atoning for it. So I'll read just kind of a portion of it. Let's see. So this passage here says, "And being cruel still, as I sailed, which is the refrain. And being cruel still as I sailed, and being cruel still my gunner I did kill," which is referencing William Moore, the man he killed in a fight on his ship. "And his precious blood did spill, and I sailed, and I sailed. I was sick and nigh to death as I sailed, as I sailed. I was sick and nigh to death as I sailed. I was sick and nigh to death, and I vowed with every breath to walk in wisdom's ways when I sailed." Kind of sort of giving the opinion perhaps he had remorse about that particular idea. But you can hear the song, the lyrics are quite simple and a lot of phrases being repeated with simple rhymes. And this makes songs like this very, very accessible, very easy to memorize. It gives some room to change some lyrics here and there. And it really gave a lot of longevity to kind of telling Captain Kidd's life. And with songs like this, including a later one published in the late 1700s called The Elegy of Captain Kidd, this was a way to kind of keep Captain Kidd's sort of celebrity alive. And it kind of starts to change his history a little bit because people start seeing him as almost this mythical figure telling kind of this, this story, this one more mournful song that we just looked at, and then an elegy later, which more sort of praises him, kind of makes his story a lot more outlandish. So songs like this, particularly for pirates, became very popular. And like I said, today, they're still sung very widely in sea shanties. So you can go on Spotify, YouTube, and you can find it right away.
And do we know anything about the intentions of the person writing the song? I mean, is it the case that it's a good thing to write a song about, and so they do that? Are they interested in have they got a particular, interest in the story being told one way or another way? What's the intention of these things that are in after people die?
It's a little bit hard to say because a lot of them were written anonymously, but oftentimes they were written to convey a specific message, to perhaps either praise or vilify. So it depends on the angle or the particular point of view that the author has. Perhaps they appreciated the life of the pirate, kind of found it inspiring in a way. There were people inspired by pirates. Pirates could become wealthy quite quickly from a working class life. Most people were born into their social classes or the wealth or lack thereof of their family and couldn't move out of that station, whereas pirates could. So there were people who were fascinated by them. Kidd in particular was quite famous because he had married up to a socialite in New York. He possibly had buried treasure. So there were songs that were kind of would praise him to kind of get these stories out, sort of also kind of inspiring people, like, you know, here's people who got wealthy and you can too. And then there are also others that were, you know, kind of really saying, oh no, it's quite an evil person. The Elegy of Captain Kidd, which I couldn't find a reproduction of, there's very few copies of actually, does have a bit about him, you know, being confronted by the gates of hell. So this kind of gives the image that he was kind of, this is a villain. So in that case, it becomes a villain song. And this is again to, you know, vilify the pirate, kind of show that maybe they weren't the good guy you thought they were, but above all, they were meant to entertain and to tell a story. And people love a story. They love a villain story. They love a hero story. And Captain Kidd was someone where you could easily make many different ballads with many interpretations of both of those angles.
Well, it's a great place to finish. I'm very sorry we've come to the end of our time, because that idea of stories, that celebrity is fundamentally about stories that people are desperate to listen to. But just before we finish, I've got a question for all of you, which is, how do you think your three celebrities would respond to the modern social media opportunities? Would they be on Twitter and Instagram all the time? Would they be hiding from it and refusing to give interviews? Would they be using it? What would be going on? Let's start with Catherine.
Okay, well, I think this question really puts me in mind of that rivalry that I talked about between James Clark Ross and his uncle John Ross. Because as I think I mentioned, it's initially John Ross, the uncle, who's more successful in winning kind of popular support. And he does this by kind of really putting himself out there and, you know, sort of actively trying to gain as much public acclaim as he can. And so he does this using the technologies that are available to him at the time. You know, he publishes a book, he gives interviews to newspapers, he sits for a lot of portraits, and he even pays for the creation of a panorama that depicts a scene from his expedition. And so I'm sure if he was around today, he would absolutely be making the most of social media and all the opportunities for self-promotion that it kind of affords. But of course, he's kind of an interesting story because in some ways it kind of backfires on him. As I said, he got criticised for being a bit too much of a showman, and actually it was his nephew, James Clark Ross, who was perhaps a bit more subtle in terms of how he publicly presented himself, although perhaps not in that portrait we saw. But
it's very striking.
Yeah.
It's similar. There are, you know, today.
Yes, yeah.
I think of the people that happens to. And Rebecca, I guess with Captain Kidd, it's interesting because he was not necessarily wanting to be seen some of the time. What do you think he'd have done about social media?
I think initially he probably would not have been on social media, but I can kind of imagine during the time he was on trial becoming quite an active Twitter user. Because he very much felt until his death that he was wrongfully accused of being a pirate, and to quote him, that he was perjured by wicked people. Because a lot of his crewmates came who he thought would speak for him at the trial to defend him, ended up testifying against him, saying that he had murdered a crewmate, saying that he had led them into an illegal attack, trying to make all of them pirates. When Captain Kidd kept insisting over and over, I had a letter of marque. I was pressured to do this. I did not murder anyone. That's something he heavily denied. And he also kept demanding that he needed to be able to call in his own witnesses, which was denied over and over and over. So I feel like Twitter would have been a platform for him to try to shout out his innocence. They're lying. They're not letting me do this. This is what the truth is. And what's actually very interesting, particularly about his letter of marque, how it was said over and over, no, we can't reproduce it. It's not here. It's in the National Archives. So you can actually look at it. So it did exist, but we're not sure why it wasn't produced. Maybe it was found after the fact. Maybe they deliberately didn't because Britain needed to make him a scapegoat. But I think
he would have had a field day. You're right.
yeah, so I can imagine during his trial, but beforehand, he was trying to stay out of sight. So before that, no. During the trial, I think Twitter would have been his choice.
Quentin, how about Emma Hamilton?
Oh, I think she'd have been an Instagram and Twitter supremo. I mean, there's an occasion when she's living in Naples where she goes and spends the afternoon with a society lady called Beatrice Acquaviva, who'd become a nun and was living in a convent. And they have this fantastic conversation. They really get on very well. Emma comes away and writes a letter saying, she's so charming, she's so fascinating. How can she bear to be kept away from the world? And that's very much who Emma was. She wanted a place in the public sphere. She demanded it, and she paid a price for it. So she would definitely have got involved with all of those mechanisms for creating and controlling identity.
It's very striking in everything we've talked about today, how history just repeats itself in terms of, people's reaction to stories. And even if they didn't have the word for celebrity, the concept is clearly not a new thing. Well, thank you. We have to finish there. Thank you all very much. We will be back soon with more Royal Museums Greenwich curators and objects and all kinds of fun things and stories of the sea, space, history and culture. If there's a question you've got to follow up on this, or you'd like to request us cover a topic in the future, do please get in touch. We are on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook in the new modern social media world. Just look for Royal Museums Greenwich. And all the past episodes we have, I think there are at least 19, probably more, episodes on all sorts of topics available, and they are at rmg.co.uk/museum from home. That's all one word at the end. And hopefully the National Maritime Museum, the Cutty Sark, the Queen's House and the Royal Observatory will all be opening their physical doors from May, so you can go along to Greenwich and visit all the things that we've all been kept away from a year. And you can just go to rmg.co.uk/visit Greenwich to find out more about all of that. So thank you to our three fabulous contributors, Catherine Gazzard, Quentin Colville and Rebecca Simon. Thank you very much to Simon Cain for the fabulous readings. Thank you to Steve Thompson for the music. James Gill was the producer, and I'm Helen Czerski. Thank you very much.